The NFL draft is one of the most unpredictable events in football, but let's take a stab at predicting who we think the Bengals will pick in 2024.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. It is Draft Miss or Draft Miss Eve, depending on when you're listening to this episode. I'm Jake Liscow. He's James Rapien. We're the Locked On Bengals podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network, covering your team every day on YouTube and everywhere you get your podcast. If you're new to the show, you can subscribe to make sure you get this content notified on your phone when it drops, so you know when there's Bengals news and analysis out there for you to take in, and two, it helps us out, and we appreciate it. We appreciate all of you as well who make us your first listen and who are everydayers. And James, today's episode is sponsored by Monopoly Go, which you can get for free on the App Store to mess with your friends' banks, or on Google Play. We're going to talk about predicting what we think the Bengals will do in the 2024 draft, as impossible a task as that is.
Yeah, it might be impossible and it's not going to be completely right. But guess what this exercise is good for? And guess what mock drafts are good for? Giving you and giving everybody the knowledge of the prospects that the Bengals are targeting that could potentially go, where they could go ahead of the 2024 NFL draft. So it's an extremely valuable exercise. I'm learning more and more every time we do it. And so, yeah, let's predict who the Bengals are going to pick. And who knows, maybe we go 10 for 10 today, Jake. I would not put it past us.
I would.
And it's a familiar face going at 18.
I would put it past us, James. We usually get a couple, but man, getting into the 7th round, figuring out where guys are going to even be available for the Bengals to pick, there are multiple reasons it's impossible. But yeah, we've talked about all of the first round options, I think, quite a bit, whether it's J.C. Latham, whether it's Tally Fuaga, whether it's Amarius Mims, whether it's one of the corners, Quinyon Mitchell, Terrion Arnold, whether it's Byron Murphy falling, where he's now expected to go top 10, or Johnny Newton, who we talked about with Joe Goodberry yesterday, had a great visit with the Bengals. We talked about almost all of the guys we think they could realistically pick at 18. But when you combine the will he be available with the will he like him cross-section of players, we land on Amarius Mims as a one that we think is most likely to be available to the Bengals. And we still think, you and I believe, are on the same page here, that plan A is an offensive tackle. And we don't think Brock Bowers is going to be there. We don't think that, maybe Byron Murphy would throw them off that plan. We don't think he's going to be there either. But even then, I think plan A is offensive tackle.
It is. I even would go past saying think. You just look at who they've brought in, who they've looked at. They would love to add a franchise offensive tackle, someone that's under contract for the next 5 years or maybe longer. They want to find their Whitworth for Joe Burrow. And that doesn't necessarily mean left tackle. They want to find their Willie. They want to find this guy that's going to be there, done that for the next 5 years, 8 years, 10 years, hopefully longer. And Amarius Mims is someone that we know they like. We know they like a lot. We know Frank Pollock likes him. And if all these other offensive tackles are gone, they may like him more than some of these guys, by the way. But if they're gone, the J.C. Lathams of the world are gone, then I think it makes a ton of sense. Now, I think you're right. Quinyon Mitchell, if he falls to 18, if all of the offensive tackles that they feel are tackles are gone, well, then they're going to go in another direction. I don't think they're going to force it. I don't think Tyler Guyton is going to be the 18th pick. No. Knock on wood. Don't think that's going to happen. But what I do think the Bengals, in a perfect world, one is Olu Fashanu or Amarius Mims or J.C. Latham, or maybe Fuanga as well. If he's there, they could go that route. If they view him as a tackle, I think it's unique that some teams think he's more of a guard. Fautanu is probably lower because they probably view him as a guard, as an interior lineman. And that's when I think you do get into, all right, is it Johnny Newton versus Quinyon Mitchell versus Terrion Arnold? If the tackles that they view are tackles are gone, that could very well happen. And I think they're comfortable picking Newton, which I wouldn't have said a month ago. I think that visit helped them a lot, helped him a lot. And it certainly changed my perception, because in February, there was no talk of him being the 18th pick. And the talk was, oh yeah, he'll be there at 18 for sure. Even a few weeks ago, it felt that way, but certainly at the NFL Combine. So for those that are holding out hope for Johnny Newton, maybe you love Quinyon Mitchell, maybe you like Amarius Mims. I do think that any of those guys are certainly in the running if they do fall to 18. Mitchell, of the three, Mitchell's the least likely of that trio.
And as we often do in late April, we get back to where we were in January before the combine with a guy like Johnny Newton being back in consideration, a point that I know Joe has made a lot as well. Joe, a frequent guest on this podcast lately. My last thought here on the Bengals first round is what has been all the chatter in the last 24 hours is other teams trading up. We got reports of the Colts and Eagles feeling out the trade up market to go after a cornerback. We've got reports of every team that was talking to Daniel Jeremiah, I think it was on Wednesday morning, trying to trade up for an offensive tackle. 5-6 teams trying to trade up for an offensive tackle all of a sudden. You got Dan Graziano with ESPN reporting that the Bengals could be worth watching for a potential trade up. They like, according to Graziano, JC Latham a lot. And so are you buying any of that? I mean, everybody's looking to trade up all of a sudden. The Bengals have not traded up in the first round forever. I think that would be a long shot, but there is at least some smoke there connecting them to Latham, who I think is not our pick here because we think he's been picked already at this point in this prediction, but a lot of smoke there connecting the Bengals to Latham as well.
Sure. If Latham's there, I think they pick him. I think they're also comfortable staying pat and saying, oh, well, Patrick Paul will be there. Blake Fisher will be there. One of these other offensive tackles that we like will be there at 49. And let's go with Johnny Newton. I don't think they are going to push super hard to get the offensive tackle at 18 because they're fine with defensive tackle at 18 or they're fine with Mitchell or Arnold. And so that comfort level of knowing, hey, there's going to be 4 quarterbacks off the board. There's going to be 3 receivers. They'll be fine and they'll get a really good player. So no, I would be shocked if they traded up. Even in fantasy realms, it would be surprising, let alone in real life. So yeah, we'll see. I wouldn't be too stunned if they traded up later, maybe at round 2. Should we discuss round 2 or you want to wait?
Yeah, let's go there next. Let's talk about day 2. And there are now 3 picks on day 2. Appreciate that comp pick fix NFL, giving us a little bit of extra work to do and the Bengals a little bit more draft capital. We'll go to day 2 coming up next.
We've all been there, either as a player or a fan. It's halftime and the scoreboard, well, it's not going your way. You're feeling low. You're not sure if you or your team can rebound. And that's when you dig deep, lift your head up and say to yourself, it's time to get back in the game, pull off some bank heists and take as much of my friends' money as I can. That's right, Jake. Let's go. I want all of your money and I'm going to take it with the smash hit mobile game, Monopoly Go. It lets you compete with your friends to get the most riches and the biggest empire. And it's the Monopoly you love, but there are a ton of twists and it's on your phone and it includes leaderboards and you can compare your progress all the time and play when you want to. You don't have to sit around a board in your living room. No. You can play it on your phone when you have the time. And there's a bunch of different boards. You can smash friends' landmarks with a wrecking ball, and you can even work with friends to crack open community chests in tournaments and gain extra rewards. So get back out there, put your game face on, and download Monopoly Go, now free on the App Store or Google Play.
Today's episode of Locked On Bengals is sponsored by FanDuel. It's playoff time in the NBA and the NHL. Baseball is going in full swing. Ellie De La Cruz looks like one of the best players in the game, putting up a stat line that looks a lot like the stat line he had when he was the number 1 prospect in baseball in Louisville. And FanDuel is your place to bet on every game. And whether you're looking for draft stuff because this is an NFL podcast and you're fixated on the NFL draft right now, or you're paying attention to those other sports as well, you can get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed right now with FanDuel. Win or lose, $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. Whether you're betting on home runs, whether you're betting on the NHL, whether you're betting on the Bengals' first player drafted, which now, as of the time of recording, is plus 350 for cornerback. FanDuel seeing this as more and more likely that cornerback should be in the conversation for the Cincinnati Bengals. FanDuel has those options for you. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to make your first bet an automatic win with that $150 in bonus bets. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook.
All the talk Jake, about a round 2 wide receiver. And I think there's a very real possibility that the Bengals go wide receiver in round 2. I also think they stick with the trenches and do what a lot of our listeners want them to do, which is prioritize offensive tackle round 1, defensive tackle in round 2, or vice versa. And that's why I think Chris Jenkins makes a ton of sense. And that's why we're mocking him to the Bengals with pick 49, the defensive tackle out of Michigan. Now, there are a lot of contenders for this pick. Obviously, it's hard to predict who's going to be there, who's not. Chris Jenkins, great run defender at Michigan, obviously a big part of their national championship team. If he does make it there, and he's higher on some of these boards, but if he does make it there, I do think they'll be tempted to not wait and add to their defensive line on day 2 with their first pick.
Yeah, I think that it's a pick that could fit them for a number of reasons. Tested well enough, has good enough size. He's a little bit smaller than you would want for a guy who excels and hangs his hat on run defending. Needs some work as a pass rusher. The pass rush data is not quite what you would want it to be. So maybe it's a different defensive tackle here in the second round. If they go offensive tackle first round, you could certainly see defensive tackle in the second round. Maybe they'll really like Braden Fisk and his nonstop motor and character, despite him being undersized as well. Maybe they'll really like the upside with Mike Hall in the second round. Maybe they'll really like Ruka Roro's versatility. And again, there's upside there with a Rororo, despite him being a fifth-year player coming out of Clemson. But defensive tackle, I think, is certainly realistic here, especially if one falls. But we're in general, I think, for me, I'll speak for myself. I have the hardest time with round 2, and I see it as a branching paths kind of thing. Like if they go offensive tackle in round 1, the most likely picks to me in the second round are wide receiver or defensive tackle. So maybe it's some of the wide receivers we've talked about in the second round: Ricky Pearsall, Troy Franklin, Keon Coleman. Maybe it's a guy like Xavier Legette, who we haven't talked about very much. Maybe that's a guy that they really like, the late breakout, which is not something they typically like, but they like him blossoming into a player that they think could be a good outside player in the NFL in the long term, and they see him as a developmental option. Of course, if they go defensive tackle in the first round, we're not talking about probably any of these guys. We're probably fixated on offensive line here. Guys like Roger Rosengarten, you're hoping are falling. Maybe this is where you talk about Patrick Paul, a guy whose size and athleticism you'd think they would really like, even if he's not necessarily as high on our boards and some of the people we've talked to. But landing on Chris Jenkins here after an offensive tackle in the first round certainly could make sense. But this is where you start to see, and I'm trying to illustrate, maybe it's hard to keep up because there's a lot of names and positions, this branching path idea, where what they do early is obviously going to dictate the way they go later. And the way that in our heads, the positions we think they prioritize are going to work out, you can really see how these different paths could start to go.
By the way, the complete disrespect, because he's a little short, Ladd McConkey. I'm gonna mention him because I do think if he does fall there, they would consider him.
Yeah,
I think they would consider Xavier Worthy as well. I don't think either one's going to be there. I'm going to throw those names out so we cover CYA, right, just in case. Yeah. So we make sure we mention whoever's picked at 49. The thing that I think is interesting here is if they go Johnny Newton round 1. Mm-hmm. There is a scenario where the tackles they're hoping are there, the Patrick Pauls of the world, are just gone. Where maybe it's not even a Blake Fisher. Maybe Blake Fisher's gone. And that's what's really tough. I think the day 2 defensive tackle depth versus the day 2 offensive tackle depth, it could be much, much different depending on the path they choose. And that's why you hear about these teams trading up probably, because they're like, well, let's go get our guy because there's a clear drop off. And when you get to this part of round 2, you don't know who's going to be there because it's going to be picked through from the tail end of round 1 and early round 2 if you didn't take one of those offensive linemen and land one of them. So there is a butterfly effect for the Bengals and the rest of the teams. I'll mention a couple others. I don't think they go running back at 49, but this is when Jonathan Brooks would start to be talked about for NFL teams in general. Trey Benson, another one I think, and both of those guys would be in play either here or at pick 80 if one of them were to fall. Not sure they'll make it that far, but I just want to throw their names out there. But I think we've covered. If Kingsley Suamatia, by the way, somehow falls, he could be in line here. But yeah, I think we've covered it as far as who they could take. My guy, Troy Franklin, by the way, I'm going to speak it into existence. Let's go, Jake. Troy falls to pick 49 and all is well in the neighborhood. But we're going with Chris Jenkins there.
I think the only ones we didn't mention are some interior offensive line options. I don't think that either of us think it's terribly likely, but it wouldn't be shocking, I guess, is the way I would put it. But like a Cooper Beebe or Christian Haynes, or if Zach Taylor falls this far, he might be picked around the 1-2 turn. Those
Zach
guys, I
Taylor.
think, sorry, Zach Frazier would be
I
guys
was
that
like, man, you ain't picking Zach Taylor at 49. He'll
no,
even tell you that's a
no.
reach. Don't do that.
No, you bring him in late, as he says, to call plays in camp. But I do think there's some interior offensive line guys that we should at least mention as possible, and within that realm of possibility, and Roman Wilson, who we haven't mentioned as a second round wide receiver,
Oh yeah.
and you
Yep.
could even throw in Jalen Polk from Washington
Yep.
as a
Yep.
potential one. I don't think they would necessarily go that route. There are major breakout age outliers there for him, and Roman Wilson. So that's why I'm kind of less inclined to project them to the Bengals. But names we should mention.
No doubt. No doubt about it. And that's what's interesting about pick 80 as we move to their first pick in round 3 is one, is this where they start to look to trade up, whether it's 49 going from 49 to 45
Yeah,
or here 80 to 73 to get their guy. And that's where it gets really interesting. We're going with a corner here and would not shock me. We didn't mention any corners in round 2 because there is a gap. Corner could be in play in round 1. And then I think we don't really see it come back into the conversation until pick 80. I do think they're going to take a corner. Who knows? Maybe they double dip with all the picks they have on day 3. But we're going with Max Melton here out of Rutgers. And I think this is someone, you just look at his profile and he's someone that they will like. My question about mocking him here, does he make it to 80? Because there's kind of a drought here, cornerbacks wise, in this part of the draft. I do wonder if he just doesn't fall all the way to 80 and gets picked in that 65 to 75 range.
there are other corners that will be picked in the second and third round. It's just they're not guys that we would think the Bengals would like. And maybe we're way off on Mike Sanders, and we should be in on Mike Sanders at this point still. And
I'm not sure he's there at 49.
yeah,
I'm not.
that's definitely possible. I just have a really hard time projecting the Bengals to go slot corner, and he's slot corner through and through. Even though they love Mike Hilton, I just have a hard time with that currently. But Max Melton, the guy in this group that has the speed they would be after, and that's why the speed size combo is why that's the name that we've kind of focused on here. He's not the biggest guy in the world, but he has adequate size to play outside, good length, and he ran a sub 4.40. They've really prioritized speed and athleticism at this position. And so for guys projected on day 2 at corner, he really does stand out as having that combination. Everybody else is either slower or smaller, projects to the slot only, and we are avoiding some of those slot only options here. Like TJ Tampa, a guy that by consensus is a second round guy that we should have talked about in consideration in the second round, but running a 4.58 is just not the kind of corner the Bengals have drafted. If it's not cornerback here, Mason Smith, I think a guy they brought in for a visit and seems to be ascending and may go earlier than our board suggests he should. Could even be in consideration at 49, not a pick we would love there, but could certainly be in consideration at 80 as well.
Yeah.
And Ben Sinnott, I think, is currently favored to be the second tight end drafted, but if he does fall, I think you would have to consider him very strongly at 80. And this is probably the beginning of the range for Jalen McMillan as well, a potential Tyler Boyd replacement if they do not go wide receiver in round 2.
And that's where we're going here with pick 97 is Jalen McMillan. And they've looked at him. Obviously, they brought him in for a visit, and it's someone that can come in right away and be your Tyler Boyd slot receiver, has been productive in college. And it's not like he's learning a new spot. Charlie Jones was doing that. He played outside a ton at Purdue, had to learn it. And so he helps solidify your wide receiver core. And heck, we had Steve Radisevich on earlier this week. What did he say? Wide receiver depth. You can get guys in round 3 that are comparable to the player you're getting in round 2. And so I think with the either 80 or 97, those are probably the favorites. I know I made that 49 pick 49 for wide receiver, and I do think that they could take a receiver that early. That's where it starts to get in play. But you pick 80, pick 97. If they haven't yet, I think this is the hot spot where they want to get one because it drops off again. And so I will get Jake's reaction to that pick, and we will continue to discuss not only pick 97, but the rest of our mock draft. Jake, we're going to have to speed up. We will do that coming up next. Today's show is brought to you by LinkedIn. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. And heck, who knows? Maybe the Bengals are leaning on LinkedIn Jobs right now as they analyze the draft and finalize their board. Actually, you don't have an entire front office doing that for your small business. And that's why you should get LinkedIn Jobs, because it's not just a job board. It helps you hire professionals that you can't find anywhere else. Over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So find the quality candidates you want to talk to faster with LinkedIn Jobs. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply.
No real reaction for me on the Jalen McMillan in the second, third round pick there, James, as you teed up before the break. I could
Come on,
certainly
Jake.
see it.
Not a
I mean,
woo?
we just
Not a woo?
no.
Touchdown.
I
No?
would like the pick. I think fine. I think that there's a chance, talking to Mike Renner yesterday, that he makes it into the third day of the draft as well. Some other receivers I could consider here. Brendan Rice is primarily the name that stands out as a receiver that hits a lot of their check boxes that they would consider, along with Keon Coleman earlier. I mentioned his name. And then some other
Javon
names
Baker.
here.
I think this is when Baker starts to come into conversation.
I
The
think both
beginning.
picks. I think 80 and 97
Yep.
potentially for Javon Baker.
Sure. Your guy.
Bernardo Green, this is probably the beginning of his range as well in the third round. It's possible he goes a little bit earlier if teams fall in love with him as one of those guys that could be a type of corner the Bengals would like. The only other names that I've got here are Dominic Pooney. In some worlds, I could see that one, an interior offensive line option. Mekhi Wingo, another LSU defensive tackle. We're going to be talking about a lot of LSU defensive tackles between now and Saturday, potentially as options for the Bengals. But let's go fourth round, James. We're into day 3 now, and boy, would it be nice to, after going Amarius Mims, Chris Jenkins, Max Melton, Jalen McMillan, go to another skill player here before there is a bit of a drop-off. And Audric Estime, I think this is where his floor would be if you're the Bengals. He might already be picked at this point, but I certainly don't think he's making it to you at 149.
No.
I lean back to a flexible offensive line option, a guy that can play interior and has experience outside. The guy they met with, Brandon Coleman, TCU, who's played tackle and guard in college.
Sign me up. This is where I want them, whether it's pick 97, pick 115, 149, get one of these versatile linemen that you think can help stabilize the interior of your offensive line. And that's what Brandon Coleman could do. And maybe he goes earlier than this. Other guys that I would like, Tanner Bortolini, we've talked about him a lot. I'm in on him as early as 97. I don't know if the Bengals will be. Maybe they should be if they're not. But getting another interior offensive lineman, it should be a priority. And it really doesn't even have anything to do with Volson or Kappa or Karras. It's just, I want someone behind those guys at minimum this year, because we know what happens as the season goes on. Guys get dinged up. They had to play an AFC championship game without 3 starters on their offensive line. That is not the recipe for success. You want to have guys that you can bank on. And so get another bite of the apple. I would love a Brandon Coleman pick in this range. And I know there will be some that say, well, you got to get the nose tackle. And I want them to realize, and I think they do, because they've met with there are a lot of nose tackles in this class. And I think a lot of them are similar. So you have a lot of late day 3 picks. So push it back, focus on the interior of the offensive line. Makes a ton of sense for me. Other names that I think start to come into play. You mentioned Estime. I think Bucky Irving starts to come into play here. If they haven't addressed wide receiver, Malik Washington. I think Luke McCaffrey, Javon Baker stays in play. I'll mention Dwayne Carter out of Duke as well. Another defensive tackle that, who knows, maybe they don't go defensive tackle early and they double dip on late day 2, early day 3. Wouldn't shock me.
Yeah, I think those are worth mentioning for sure. McKinley Jackson, if they do choose to go nose tackle early, I know you just talked about pushing it later into day 3. I think this is probably the ceiling there, but you're right that there should be a lot of similarly tiered late day 3 nose tackles in this class. They could pick one at 149. That's not the route we're going. They could pick Quantez Stiggers here, a guy that I'm going to continue to talk about until he's drafted.
Like him. You've sold me on him. I'm in.
It's a fun story. It's a
He's
really fun
good.
story. And,
He's
and
good. That's why I'm in. I don't care about his story. It is a fun story, and he's got a great name. He's good. That's why I like him. I like good.
there's some development time, but a guy whose experience is playing in the CFL as a 20, 21, 22-year-old is very interesting. And they've gone to the CFL well before. But Jaheim Bell is a guy that maybe this is wishful thinking. I've been targeting and hoping the Bengals would go that route on day 3. And so 149 for Jaheim Bell could be the fit. That's what I'm going to project here. But you could see them shying away because he's an undersized guy. They just need that yard after catch weapon in this
Mhm.
offense. And if you're not getting Sinnott and you're not getting Bowers, because we don't think that they're getting Bowers, Jaheim Bell would be the other guy to do it, and he could be available in this range.
Yep, no doubt about it. Also, you just mentioned yard after catch. We didn't mention him. I think pick 80, Malachi Corley could be in the mix.
Sure.
If he's there, I don't think we mentioned him. So I just want to
And,
throw it out that.
and
I thought of Yak, and I was like, oh, Corley.
yeah. And you mentioned Malik Washington as well, talking about Yak guys. You did just mention that name. And
Yeah.
that would be another guy in that same caliber. We've got 4 picks left here, James. Late day 3.
Yeah. And real quick, Eric All, another tight end in this range that they
Mhm.
met with 3 times, brought him in for a top 30 as well. So maybe they go that route. But let's get to these other picks here. After Jaheim Bell, another guy that they've met with, and they get their nose tackle, Evan Anderson out of Florida Atlantic. I love it. I love waiting till now. I think this is when you get the value. I think Evan Anderson can give you those snaps right now, and you're not reaching early on. You're still able to get that interior offensive line help and a quality offensive lineman. You add a guy like Jaheim Bell, and then you still get your nose tackle on Evan Anderson, someone that I think at this stage of the draft, if you find someone that can contribute as a rookie, it's really hard to do. And I think they did it with Evan Anderson.
And maybe it's Jordan Jefferson. Maybe the other LSU tackle I told you we would be mentioning. Maybe it is McKinley Jackson going in the Dane Brugler range more than where you've seen him on some other big boards where Dane has him as a day 6 or around 6-7 guy. Maybe it's Chris Boyd from Iowa, Northern Iowa, where they sent their position coach. Maybe it's the local guy, Jawan Briggs. There are some nose tackles later. I would be surprised if they're in on Tavondre Sweat at this point, to be fair. I know we haven't mentioned his name, but since we're on the topic of nose tackles, would be shocked. Outside of that, Tip Raymond, perhaps, if they don't get a tight end before this point, is a guy that I would think about here. And Xavier Thomas, edge rusher from Clemson, who they had a lot of contact with, I think starts to come into play around this area as well. I'm sure there's some other guys we're not mentioning. We will tee up day 3 before day 3. After day 2 a little bit at the end of that show on Friday night. So there will be other guys that we're able to talk about once we have a little bit of a clearer picture of who's still available at that point. But let's go to the compensatory 6th round pick and another guy they've met with a lot. And that's kind of how you identify some of these guys is Josh Cephas, UTSA wide receiver.
Yep. And the double dip at wide receiver, the double dip at cornerback, the double dip at offensive line, double dip at defensive line. I think you're going to see multiple double dips here, which cue the Seinfeld reference. But no, I think getting 2 receivers makes a ton of sense. And you want to find someone that can contribute right away and then maybe try to find your next Andre Yosevach. And that's what Cephas would fall under, is one of these small school guys that you met with that you really like. And I don't know that they really like him. Obviously, we're projecting that, but that's what happened with Andre. And then they got him in the building and they're like, whoa, he's better than we thought. He's farther along than we thought. He's going to be able to contribute right away. So you never know with Josh Cephas. So I think this pick makes a lot of sense. And now we're talking about a lot of the same names.
Yeah.
And so I think we wait and go through them after we give our next 2 picks in the 7th round. And then we can name 6th and 7th round potential targets, because you have the linebacker. And I do think they take a linebacker at some point. So get to your guy.
Yeah, I don't know that he's my guy.
He's your guy.
Picked a name here that it looked like it fit that would be in this range. They did have their linebackers coach at the Notre Dame Pro Day where there were a couple of linebackers to see. To be fair, both of whom could be picked on day 3. And JD Bertrand is the one that I'm landing on here. He's lower on our consensus board, so it's more likely that he's available. And he was a 2-time captain. And that is roughly the extent of the projection for the Bengals here. I think they would like a linebacker, a guy that they've seen up close and a guy that was a 2-time captain. Checks a lot of boxes for the Bengals.
No doubt. And then one position that they haven't addressed yet, I do think they're going to address it, running back. Not sure when they do. I think it could be as early as round 4 with Audric Estime, maybe earlier, but I think it's tough. Maybe, though. The right guy's there at the right time. But Kendall Milton out of Georgia is the final pick here. And we obviously didn't do any trades. Hard to project trades. We're trying to give you the prospects that they're potentially targeting, why they're targeting them, where they could target them. And we'll see how many we get right, if we get any right. But yeah, Kendall Milton could make some sense. Obviously, he has size and would bring some size to that backfield with Chase Brown and Zach Moss.
And he had an injury that kind of led to a timeshare for him, so his productivity numbers were impacted there. But when he was on the field, 6.2 yards per attempt on 298 career attempts. So low tread on the tires, which is something they like. Productivity, which is something they liked. Played for a big program, which is something they like. And one of the best yards after contact per attempt backs in this class, especially for guys that you could get a little bit later on. And so there are some reasons to think the Bengals could go that route. Not a burner by any means. So if you're looking for speed, this is not where you get it at the end of the draft. But some other day 3 names that we should talk about, James. Anybody on your list that you want to mention before we get out of here?
Yeah, for sure. As far as linebackers go, Jalen Ford is one, Jordan McGee another. Keep your eyes on those 2 guys. If they go defensive tackle, Jawan Briggs, there's a reason. Mike Brown came up to him at the local pro day and talked to him. That's rare. That's unique. Would not be shocked if they take Jawan Briggs. The reason I didn't push to mock him, Jake, I think he's going to go a bit earlier than some are anticipating, and a little bit earlier for the Bengals to take him. Another name, Dylan Johnson, big running back out of Washington that I certainly think they could target maybe round 6 with that that first round 6 pick, or maybe he's there in that second round 6. He had 193 receptions in college and dealt with some injuries, but at that stage of the draft, you're willing to take that risk. I think that's safety. If they go Trey Taylor, Air Force, maybe at the end of round 7, I could see him in round 7 at some point. I think that's everyone. I'm just trying to make sure. We didn't mention Christian Boyd yet. Christian, did you?
I think I did.
Okay. Christian Boyd, Justin Rogers, all those nose tackles certainly keep them on your radar as well. But literally, our goal right now is to make sure we're mentioning guys that should be on your radar. We'll do it throughout the draft, but this way you're at least aware, and you're like, oh, hey, I heard that on Locked On.
I've got a couple too really quick. Just we've talked about some of these guys. Malik Mustafa, Wake Forest safety. The Bengals had their safety coach at the pro day there. Dijon Anthony, they brought in for a top 30, the Ole Miss safety. We talked about Quantez Stiggers plenty. Don't need to bring that name up again. Jalen Green, James Madison, linebacker / edge player. I'm not sure what exactly position he played in the NFL. A guy they have showed some interest in if you're looking at late day 3 options. In addition to Trajan Jeffcoat from Arkansas, we got Avery Jones, interior offensive lineman that we added to the draft spreadsheet when it was reported that the Bengals had some extended time spent with him at his pro day and in virtual meetings. You mentioned, I think before we started recording, Baver Matos, the guy who didn't play football, who is now being looked at as a potential football player. He would project to be an offensive lineman at 6'7", 313. Giovanni Manu for another late offensive tackle prospect from the University of British Columbia, who we've talked about. Those guys could be more priority free agent types, but the NFL seems to be blowing up Manu in particular as a late target. For tight end, just wanted to make sure we mentioned Tanner McLaughlin and Trey Knox. And for wide receiver, wanted to make sure we mentioned Jacob Cowing as well. And I think that is all the names that I have on my list to mention as potential Bengals targets. So it's time for the draft. Or your next episode will be a reaction to the first round.
It's draft time, baby. It's draft time, Jake. Yeah, can't wait. Really excited. We will join you on Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday night. So when you wake up Friday morning, you'll obviously have our reaction. When you wake up Saturday morning, you'll have our reaction. And then, heck, Sunday morning, you're going to have our reaction. And that'll be there for you Monday as well. So it's going to be a busy weekend, Jake, but obviously we're excited.
Always is. And you can make sure you stay tuned to our socials as well for any in-draft live coverage that maybe one or two of us are doing. I'm doing. I don't know what your plan is, James, but you can find out if we're doing any live plans on socials as well, at Jake Liscow, at James Rapien. Until next time, thanks for listening to this draft preview episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. Hoo day, and have a good one.